Where to?
Yeah.
I just wanted to say quickly, as Anne was talking about CIS and the CPTR program, thank you to everyone here for everything we've done for the scholarship fund that we had.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So within the community, we raised just over $10,000, which exceeded our goal. And then between the board as well, the BPRG board, that meant we raised a total of just over $40,000 for the scholarship fund, and it all goes to CIIS and then is matched by CIIS. And that goes to members of the Boston cohort that are LGBTQI, BIPOC, or working in areas where they're serving members of underserved populations. So it's really a tremendous effort, and just so much gratitude to everyone here. I was so shocked personally this year that we were able to do this and exceed last year's scholarship. And yes, thanks everyone. And then also to anyone who's new to the BPRG, who came to see Dennis talk and hasn't signed up, you can sign up on our website so that you can get invites to upcoming meetings. I'll put the website in the chat. There's like a form where you can sign up. If you want to see past links, there on our website and on our YouTube channel. And then for existing and new members, we usually have managed all of our members in a Google Sheet, and it's getting a little bit hard to manage because there's over 1,200 of us now. So we are looking into solutions to make managing the database easier. But in the meantime, if you have any issues with the Google Sheet or how to change your information, you can just email us and I'll put the email address in the chat. So those are all my updates.
Great. Thank you, Sherry.
Amazing.
Very important updates, and thank you for remembering all that. So, welcome to Dennis McKenna. So, Dennis has conducted research in ethnopharmacology for over 40 years. He's a founding board member of the Hefter Research Institute. He's the younger brother of Terence McKenna, who was an ethnobotanist and a mystic who advocated for the responsible use of naturally occurring psychedelic plants. Terence died in 2000, and Dennis has continued his legacy. From 2000 to 2017, Dennis taught courses on ethnopharmacology and plants in human affairs at the Center for Spirituality and Healing at the University of Minnesota. Since 2019, Dennis has been working with colleagues to manifest a long-term dream, the McKenna Academy of Natural Philosophy, a nonprofit founded in the spirit of the ancient mystery schools and dedicated to the study of plant medicines, consciousness, intelligence in nature, preservation of indigenous knowledge, and a revisioning of humanity's relationship with nature. Shippen and I were lucky enough to go down to Peru on a retreat with Dennis. We stayed at the beautiful Wilcatica Retreat Center, and that was in 2014. I just feel so honored to have him here. It's great to be with you again, Dennis.
Thank you.
Today, his talk is entitled Climbing the Vine, 45 Years of Ayahuasca, a personal retrospective on his involvement with this medicine over many years, including some adventures and misadventures of the McKenna brothers. I'm sure we're going to have a good time with you, Dennis. Thank you so much. All yours. Oh, and I should say, we hope to have time at the end for Q&A. So as we get closer to the end of the talk, if you could put some questions in the chat if you'd like to ask Dennis any, and I'll be monitoring that. Thank you. All yours. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Anne and Sherry. You seem to be the main instigators of this, organizers. So I appreciate the back and forth that we've had. And I remember our time together at Wilcatica very fondly. It's a magical place, as you know. And it comes as a bit of a shock to me that it was so long ago, 2014. It seems like a whole other era. It wasn't another century, but it was a long time ago, it seems, in the scheme of things. So I'm glad to see you're all thriving and continue this work. And yes, I've been busy too. So, and thank you for the lovely introduction. That I appreciate that. So I was looking at my talk earlier. It used to be titled Climbing the Vine, 45 Years of Ayahuasca, but I realized with a bit of a shock that time has gone on. So I changed the title. It's now 50 years of ayahuasca, which is rather sobering considering I first went to the Amazon in 1971. So I will give this talk, and then we can have some Q&A hopefully. And if there's time, there's a little movie clip within the presentation that I want to show, but there may not be time. And I'll put that clip in the chat room or email it to Anne and Sherry, and they can share it later if we don't have time. But it comes toward the last of it. So if I can share my screen here, it appears that I can. Okay. Let me see. I want to remove the navigation thing. Let's see here. Yeah, okay. All right, so everybody has seen the slide, I guess. Hopefully this is working. Yes, I am a member of the Hefter Research Organization. I was involved in that, the founding of that, which took place in 1993. And I think that all of the aspirations that we had for Hefter at the time have now been realized. And I don't think at the time in 1993 that any of us really expected that we'd be where we are, but times change, and the recognition that psychedelics are getting for their potential to heal, I think not only individual people, but potentially the soul, the soul of the planet in a certain way, the collective soul is now being recognized. And as Sherry mentioned, the latest endeavor that I've been working on is the McKenna Academy. It's a 501c3, and as the name implies, it's basically its mission is education. We started out with the idea that it was going to be a lot about retreats and conferences. We still have that aspiration, but COVID has a way of rearranging people's priorities. So now, for the moment, we're doing most of our seminars and podcasts and so on online, although we do have a big conference planned for May, which I'll tell you about later. So yeah, on the left panel here, this is the what I call the mother ayahuasca vine that I introduced to the Big Island in 1976 to my brother and his wife's land on the Kona coast. And so this is a monster size ayahuasca vine. It's about 1,500 feet long, weighs several tons. The main stem is thicker than my waist, which is pretty thick. So this is what they really call the mother vine. It's truly a beautiful plant. So we'll go from there. So you can read about some of this, some of our life in my memoir, The Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss, which came out in 2012. And I'm actually working on a second edition with Synergetics Press. So that's going to be published later this year. In 1971, my brother and I went to a place in the Colombian Amazon called La Chorrera. And we went in the companionship of several equally fanatic compadres, if you will. And the reason we went to La Chorrera is because we were looking for an exotic Witoto hallucinogen that no one had ever heard of. And so that was the reason that we ended up at La Chorrera, was in search of this plant. And this is our group. This is actually what you might call the original Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss. I mean, we kind of called ourselves that. We were convinced that we were in search of a big secret, and we sort of had a sense of humor about it, you know, being Irish. We didn't take anything too seriously. So we called ourselves tongue in cheek, the Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss. We really had no idea how accurate that was as subsequent events turned out. But so here we are, right after we had arrived at La Chorrera after a 4-day trek through the jungle. And what we were looking for at La Chorrera was this preparation called ukuhe, which is made from Varola species. Varola are plants in the nutmeg family, these trees that very much resemble nutmeg in outward appearance. And they produce a reddish sap, a reddish resin that's full of tryptamines like DMT and 5-methoxy-DMT. And many indigenous groups in the Amazon use Varola resin as snuffs, as you can see here. They actually they extract the resin, they dry it down, and they make a powder, and then they use that to blow into each other's nose rather forcefully through these 3-foot-long tubes, and the reaction is rather dramatic. In fact, I think perhaps even without any active ingredients, it would be a shock to the system. But we were looking for ukuhe, a much less well-known Varola preparation that's orally active. That's why we were interested in it, because of its oral activity. Instead of making a snuff out of it, ukuhe is taken orally. And as many of you know, the tryptamines, DMT and 5-methoxy-DMT, are not active orally without a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. It blocks the enzyme in the gut that breaks these things down. Then it can be absorbed in the active form, and then it becomes orally active. And this is the basis of ayahuasca. Ayahuasca is made of a combination of the vine, which contains MAO inhibitors, and the admixture plants, which contain DMT, but I'll get into that a little later. So we went looking for ukuhe, and when we went through a village on the way to La Chorrera, we encountered a Colombian anthropologist named Dr. Horatio Collier. We knew he was there. We heard from his people in Bogota that we should expect to run into him at some point, and we did. When we got there, he, of course, had no way of knowing that we were coming. This was not an era when you could send a text and say, I'll be there next Tuesday. So we just kind of showed up, and our group was far more colorful than any of the Witoto people in the region. I mean, we looked like we had stepped right out of Haight-Ashbury, which basically we had. I mean, we all had beads and long beards, and we were wearing white linen clothing, and we were quite a sight, you know. Plus, one of our companions had a number of pets with him, monkeys, dogs, cats, and so on. So I'm sure that Dr. Collier was quite appalled when we showed up, totally without warning. And then when we spoke with him and said we're looking for ukuhe, that really set him back, because it was like, how do you know about this? Why are you even here? And how do you know about ukuhe? And we said, well, you know, Richard Schultes had published a paper about it, and we were following that, because Schultes in this paper, the title of which was Varola as an orally active hallucinogen. So we knew that this is what we were looking for. So on the strength of that paper, we had gone to La Chorrera, because La Chorrera was the ancestral home, the original home of the Witoto tribe. And they were the keepers of this pharmacology. But Dr. Collier said, this is like the biggest shamanic secret of these people. You're not supposed to know about this. If you go to this tribe and start talking about ukuhe, they will likely kill you. And, so don't do it. I mean, he was being very, discouraging of it. But we said, well, we know, Doc, we'll be careful, we'll be discreet, we won't just ask anybody, but we'll, thanks for your advice. Anyway, we continued on, and I'm sure he was relieved to see us go. When we got to La Chorrera, what we were looking for was the ukuhe. What we found immediately in the pastures around this mission village of La Chorrera, this tiny Capuchin mission, was pastures with Cebu cattle, and out of every cow pie were growing huge clusters of Psilocybe cubensis, the pan-tropical psilocybin mushroom. And we were very cavalier about it. We thought we were looking for this big secret ukuhe. As it turns out, the mushroom turned out to be the real secret. And we started using it very casually. But quickly it got serious as it started downloading a lot of information about certain things we could do that would essentially carry out a psychosurgery on our own DNA. This is all be sort of mythologized as the experiment at La Chorrera, which I'm not going to go into here. I don't want to talk about it. I've talked about it so much. In April 2021, we did a 50-year retrospective on the experiment at La Chorrera. So if you want to look at that event on the McKenna Academy website, you can. There's some pretty interesting videos and discussions of that whole thing. But the mushroom turned out to be, the real teacher, and it really quickly kind of rearranged our priorities. Well, 10 years later, as a graduate student at the University of British Columbia in 1981, I returned to the Amazon, this time to do real ethnobotany. And this is just to kind of orient you. La Chorrera is here on the Rio Igara-Paraná. That flows into the Putumayo, which is the river that separates Colombia on the north and Peru on the south. In 1981, I went to Iquitos in Peru, and some of you, undoubtedly, some of you have been to Iquitos. Iquitos in the modern era of ayahuasca tourism has become kind of the epicenter of ayahuasca tourism. It wasn't at the time. In 1981, there was very little ayahuasca tourism. Iquitos was a quiet little town, and these days it's anything but. But we went to Iquitos and down the Amazon to the Rio Ampiacu, the river of poisons. And the reason we went there is because these villages here, Brio Nuevo and Terrafuego and Pucurquillo, are all Witoto villages, because the Witoto people were forcibly relocated from La Chorrera during the rubber boom in the early part of this century. Essentially, the Witoto and other tribes were enslaved to work in the rubber industry, and this is one reason why the Witoto culture is decimated, because they've lost many of their traditions. They're essentially a traumatized culture due to their history, and a lot of times the loss of plant knowledge goes along with that. So anyway, this is just to orient you to kind of the geography of this. And this is the sunset on the Rio Ampiacu, which means the river of poisons. The poison in question is a particularly powerful arrow poison that called ampi, that these groups in that area prepare. So we had various, this expedition was in part sponsored by or done in collaboration with the Institute for Ecotechnics, which had brought a research vessel, so-called research vessel. It turned out not really to be very useful, but we joined forces with them. We met them in Iquitos. We knew that this encounter was going to take place. And on the way to Iquitos, the main ship, which was a concrete hulled, looked exactly like a Chinese junk, smashed into a barge and stove a big hole in the hull. So it wasn't going anywhere, but we were able to arrange to use some of the boats that they had and rent a couple of pecky with thatched roofs and so on. And our crew got down to Paybas, the first place on the Iquitos where we could then go upriver. So this is me. This is Wade Davis, who some of you undoubtedly have heard of. He was selected to be the chief science officer of this expedition. We were very lucky to have Wade along because he, even at that time, much younger man, but even at that time, a very experienced Amazonian explorer, as opposed to myself and my companion, another graduate student, who were complete tenderfoots and really had no idea what we were doing. But with Wade's help, we were able to obtain the Ukuhe. Terrence, although officially not part of the expedition, insisted on coming. And so he came down and joined us for a couple of weeks when we went to Pucuarquillo and these other villages to look for the Ukuhe. There he is standing under the kumala tree. All of the Varrolas are generically called kumalas. And so we started asking around if people knew how to prepare this ukuhe. And what we found was very few people actually had any knowledge of it. People remembered it as something their grandfathers did or their fathers did, but they had a fairly murky idea how to prepare it. But out of this pool of informants, various people that we talked to from different tribes, there was a couple who seemed to really know what they were talking about, and they offered to prepare it for us, to prepare samples. So in order to do that, we had to harvest a kumala tree and strip the bark off and collect the resin. So this is Wade and I going at it to sacrifice this poor kumala tree to science, I guess you could say. And then our informant, who turned out to be with the Bora tribe, Don Marcos, actually remembered how to do it. And so we were able to photograph the preparation, and he took us through all the stages of preparation, ending up with this product. And if that reminds you of anything, I can assure you it tastes about the same. It's not the most tasty thing, but you can take about a third of this in an oral dose, and then that's the oral activity ukuhe. And we collected about 7 samples when we were doing this expedition, 2 or 3 weeks in this area from different practitioners. Some of them turned out not to have any alkaloids at all. Others were high in alkaloids, and obviously we had to bioassay all of these in the field. That's the lab assay, the large animal bioassay. This is something that ethnopharmacologists just have to do. It's part of the job. And so we did lab assays on all of these samples. This one turned out to be one of the more potent. But even at that, it was not spectacular. It wasn't what we what we had expected. It wasn't a mind-shattering hallucinogen that we'd hoped it would be. Most of the effects were physiological. So compared to mushrooms, which we found at La Chorrera, this was not impressive, but it was, an example that this knowledge about how to prepare this did still exist in some form, but pretty well a highly degraded form. So after our expedition, we tried to get some samples. We brought back living specimens of the varroa, and Terence is getting ready to go to the airport here after we're back in Iquitos, and these red seeds below are the seeds of the varroa. They look exactly like nutmegs, but the chemistry, of course, even though varroa's in the nutmeg family, the chemistry is completely different. But he smuggled these seeds back and eventually got them to Hawaii, where they had some land, but they're very difficult to grow, so none of them grew. Some of the other live plants that we exported, including ayahuasca and the admixture plants, we had better luck with those. So ayahuasca it was the main focus, or another component of this 6 months field work that I did in Peru for my graduate work. So again, this is the mother vine that we introduced in Hawaii in 1976. It's a very beautiful plant, as you can see. One of the more robust plants that you'll encounter. The large mother vines like this weigh several tons. They're 1,500 feet long. This is what it looks like down here in the right lower corner after it knocked the tree down some years later. Just ended up a tangled mess of branches and leaves, which is what vines do to trees, especially lianas. And then this is the admixture plant, Psychotria viridis, from those original collections. So this is these are the botanical ingredients, and Banisteriopsis caapi. The vine is itself called ayahuasca, as the beverage is, just to confuse you. And ayahuasca is prepared from a combination of Banisteriopsis caapi stems and admixture plants that contain DMT. So it's the admixtures, Psychotria viridis, and Diploteris cabarrhena that give the ayahuasca psychedelic kick. And chacruna, as a Psychotria viridis is called, is used through most of the Amazon basin. Diploteris cabarrhena is used north of the Putumayo. Both are high in DMT. Diploteris is in the same family as ayahuasca, but the chemistry is tryptamines instead of beta carbolines. And some ethnographers say that the difference between ayahuasca and yahe is the admixture. Yahe is prepared north of the Putumayo using this as an admixture. Okay, so on our field trip, our informant was this gentleman here, Don Fidel Mozambite. He was, we knew about him when we went to Pucallpa because my brother and his wife had been to Pucallpa in 1976. So because of that connection, we were able to reconnect with Don Fidel. And he was very kind. He was very open to us. You can imagine, again, you can't send a message or anything, you just show up. So, imagine what he must have thought when these two young graduate students, barely speaking any Spanish, come into his courtyard and say, "We're here to learn all about ayahuasca. Tell us what you know." We weren't quite that unsubtle, but anyway, he looked at us and sort of, "Okay, all right, another gringo." and so he was actually, he and his uncle Don Jose understand that we were trying to investigate the ingredients. So he was happy to show us how to prepare it. He made several preparations which we could document and film, and then take samples back to the lab for laboratory analysis. And so in that sense, he got what we were doing. He was very taciturn. Didn't really let on what he thought of us. He must have thought we were both completely nuts. But he let us spend time at his place, and we took ayahuasca with him a number of times. And this was, he was the real deal. I mean, he had the knowledge. He had a vast repertoire of icaros, of these magical songs, and this was distinctly not ayahuasca tourism. This was this man, ministered to the people in his village. And when we went to the sessions, that's usually what was happening. There was one or two people that had come to get healing for one thing or another. And so it was a very authentic experience. Yeah. Am I?
Mm-hmm.
Somebody needs to mute, I think. I'm not sure who it is, but there's background noise. Okay, so this is Juan Ruiz, who was the person, when we went to Iquitos, the director of the herbarium at the time, Franklin Ayala, designated Juan, who was a forestry student at the time, to be the person to lead these clueless gringos into the jungle, make sure they didn't do anything stupid, and bring them back alive. And yeah, if we got some plants collected in the meantime, that would be fine too. And so he took us out and led us to the plants that we were looking for. And since then, he was a forestry student at the time, but since then he's now become the curator of the herbarium in Iquitos at the Universidad Nacional Amazonia Peruana, or UNAP. And Juan and I have become good friends over the years. We've continued to work together. He's not that much younger than me, just a few years, so he's getting close to retirement. But we have some projects still that we're working on, including we're working on trying to make a documentary series about Amazonian traditional medicine in this area. Juan is a key figure here. He's unique individual because he's got one foot in traditional medicine. His father was a healer. He is not a traditional medicine practitioner. He's a botanist, but he has the other foot in science. So this is a wonderful bridge between traditional knowledge and scientific knowledge. And he's also not a person who writes things down, so he's one of these people about which it said, when a medicine man dies, it's as though a library has burned down. Juan is that library. It's all in his head. And we're trying to work with him to document what he knows. He knows a vast amount about all the plants of the region. We're trying to document what he knows and put it into a series of videos, and then from that do as a springboard to that, do a series of short documentaries on the kind of current state of the art of Amazonian ethnomedicine as it exists now in the post-COVID, post-ayahuasca tourism era. So he was tremendously helpful. And then finally, I got all this stuff to the lab. I had collection permits, but I flew from Lima, finally got back from Pucallpa, went to Lima, and took a overnight red-eye flight back to Vancouver. I got into Vancouver airport about 4 a.m. And the poor customs officer there, I think it must have been close to the end of her shift, but I showed up and I looked pretty wild and crazy. I just come out of the jungle. I had duffel bags full of collections, bundles of bark, bags of leaves, plant presses, collection bottles, just a whole panoply of stuff, and I poured it out on the table. I dumped it out on the table and I said, "Don't worry, officer, I have permits for all this. Would you like to see my permits?" She took one look at me. She looked at the table full of stuff. She said, "You're the person my supervisors warned me about. Just get out of here." So I didn't even have to show the permits. I just packed it up, called a taxi, and went to the lab at UBC. So that was my homecoming, which was kind of nice that I didn't have to go through all that. And then 3 years later, like all good graduate students are supposed to do, I published a couple of papers on my finding, monoamine oxidase inhibitors and ayahuasca, and the same for the Varrola preparations, because my thesis was kind of a comparison of the chemistry and the pharmacology of these two orally active tryptamine preparations from completely different botanical sources, but similar chemistry, similar pharmacology. So these were the first two papers that I published. This is what our initial findings on this. Well, okay, that was published in 1984. So flash forward to 1991. In 1991, I was invited to participate in a conference that was organized by the UDV, the Brazilian group that uses ayahuasca as a sacrament. They call it Huasca. And they invited me and everybody, a number of other investigators, chemists, pharmacologists, ethnobotanists, and so on, to a conference in Sao Paulo in 1991. And it turns out the rationale, or sort of the real agenda, the hidden agenda of that, was they wanted to carry out a biomedical study of their brew, of their sacrament. The CONFAN, the Brazilian agency that's kind of like the DEA and kind of like the FDA, had been considering whether to ban ayahuasca, or huasca as these folks called it. And these members of the UDV wanted outside investigators to do a biomedical study to demonstrate that it was not harmful, it was anything but a public health menace. So they wanted to do this biomedical study, and they invited us to do that. I returned to the States, and I was able to get some funding to do this work. The Hefter Research Institute was just getting started at the time, so some of the funding came through them. Some of the funding came through Botanical Dimensions, which was a nonprofit that my brother and his wife had founded. One of the main funders of this work, believe it or not, his last name was Rockefeller, Lawrence Rockefeller, who apparently must have been the black sheep of the family, I'm not sure, but he recognized the value of investigating these visionary plants, as he put it. So with that funding, we were able to raise about $75,000, and we went back to Manaus in 1993 and conducted the funding, the study. I mean, we had an international group of collaborators, Brazilians, some from Finland, some from the US, across a variety of disciplines, chemists, pharmacologists, physicians, and so on. So we conducted this study at the Nucleo Calpari, the UDV. They are a church, so their use and practice of ayahuasca is very different from traditionally in the Amazon, where it's basically under the control of curanderos. And here it's an organized religion with a doctrine and a priesthood and temples scattered throughout Brazil. and it's they gather to drink ayahuasca ceremonially about every 2 weeks. So in order to do this study, we had to do a preparo. We had to prepare enough of the material to do in the study, and the members of the UDV know exactly how to do this, how to prepare ayahuasca on a semi-industrial scale, because they had to make enough ayahuasca to feed 10,000 people every 2 weeks. So it was rather an industrial operation. And in fact, most of the temples have their own gardens, and they just make enough for their congregations. But then you see this duplicated throughout Brazil. So it's quite a long process. They have to smash the bark and mix it with the chacruna leaves, and then boil the whole thing up for about 48 hours. This process takes very slow boil to prepare the basic brew, and then they concentrate it down. They have to bioassay it at various stages to make sure the quality is good. This is Glaucus de Souza Brito. He's a member of the UDV. He's actually he was an immunologist working for I think the World Health Organization. That was his day job. But he is assaying the quality of the brew there. And of course, the only way to really assess the quality is to try it, to take samples and sample them during this 48-hour preparation period. So it's an industrial operation, but it's also as much a ritual as anything else. I mean, many songs are sung. The medicine is fumigated with tobacco, and there's a lot of ritual that goes on. Anyway, they made enough of the brew to do the study. And then we did it. We had no access to a hospital or a clinic. So the volunteers just came to the temple in the morning, and we put an indwelling catheter in and into their veins to collect blood sample, and then take various types of measurements, simple measurements such as, heart rate, blood pressure, pupillary dilation, and these sorts of things. So we collected that data, and here's some of the investigators. This is Jace Calloway, biochemist, American, but living in Finland at the time. Charles Grobe, many of you are familiar with him. He's at the UCLA Director of Adolescent Psychiatry. He's a Hefter, also a Hefter member, and we selected him to be the principal investigator because he had an MD behind his name, and I did not. And this is me. I'm at this point, I think my role is basically diminished to chief test tube labeler. But anyway, we ran 15 volunteers. And the volunteers were great. I mean, they were really happy to participate in this study. They could see the significance of it. So we conducted, besides the physiological measurements, we did various psychological tests, various instruments, psychological questionnaires to assess depression, cognitive abilities, and this sort of thing. And we also did in-depth, psychiatrically structured life story interviews with all of the subjects. So out of this study, there were about 8 peer-reviewed papers that emerged from this study over the next decade, ranging from pharmacokinetics to psychological profiles. So our key findings here was that we found no evidence of any kind of acute toxicity, no surprises there, no evidence of any neurological or cognitive or personality dysfunctions in long-term users. And I should mention, everyone in our cohort had been a regular user, a member of the UDV for at least 10 years. Some of them had been members for as long as 40 years. So there was kind of a large age range happening there. And our personality, our psychological instruments that we administered showed that in comparison to an age-matched control, the members of the UDV were actually more functional when it came to cognitive functions, recall, memory, and this kind of thing. So a slightly but significantly more functional than their cohorts who were not drinkers. The most interesting thing on the psychological level is most of the members who had joined had histories. They joined at times in their lives that were in crisis. So they had histories of drug abuse or alcoholism, more commonly, often domestic violence, run-ins with the authorities, all of this. So usually they came to the UDV at a time of crisis in their lives on the advice of a friend who was already a member. That's the only way you could get in. And in their interviews, most of them described these terrifying initial experiences with ayahuasca, that they could see kind of their life story. They could see the direction they were headed and where they were going to end up, not in a good place if they didn't change their lives in a more positive way. So these experiences were cathartic for them and transformative, as we know the ayahuasca can be. And so they took it to heart, and these people actually changed their lives. And they all said that it was the tea, as they called it, it was the ayahuasca, but it was the context of the UDV, this very supportive religious community, who were there to help these people, turn their lives around and become productive citizens. The UDV, even though they're a group that uses ayahuasca, they use a psychedelic drug, but they're fairly conservative. They're fairly buttoned down people. I used to joke, you guys are like Mormons, but in the sense that, in a sense that's complementary to Mormons, because whatever you think about Mormons, they are very much invested in community support and supporting members of their community. And you saw very much the same dynamic going on with the UDV. People didn't just go every 2 weeks to drink ayahuasca. They did stuff. They ran, free clinics in the inner cities. They would go into prisons and actually give people ayahuasca, which was legal, and help prisoners kind of turn their lives around. So it was a very active and compassionate kind of community, very impressive in a certain way. And basically their Christian, their values were Christian values, but they really lived those values. So on the psychological front, we had this remarkable data about how they had really changed their lives and turned their lives in positive directions thanks to the tea. One of the questions that we had brought with us to ask, or that we wanted to ask, was, are there any biochemical markers? Is there anything about ayahuasca drinkers that separate them from people in the same socioeconomic and age ranges who are not drinkers? Anything obvious? We really had no idea, but that was a question we wanted to ask. Well, it turns out we made a surprising finding. We found that the long-term users compared to non-drinkers of ayahuasca had significantly elevated densities of serotonin transporters. We were using platelets for this measurement. We couldn't use brain tissue for obvious reasons, but platelets are recognized in psychopharmacology as kind of a peripheral marker of changes going on in the central nervous system. So we found that ayahuasca upregulated these serotonin transporters. And what did that mean? We didn't really have an idea. There was a biochemical difference, but what did it mean? Well, Later, we got into the literature on this and tried to identify what the significance of this might be. And we found there was a number of deficits related, a number of disorders related to deficits in the serotonin transporters. In other words, downregulation or abnormally low levels of transporters associated with alcoholism, particularly type 2 alcoholism. That's alcoholism with proclivities to violence, associated with homicidal and suicidal behaviors associated with binge eating. So the fit was almost too neat in the sense that we had the psychological data and the testimony from the subjects, and then this biochemical data sorted, what might have been at the basis of their at the neurochemical basis of their dysfunctions, which apparently ayahuasca was able to reverse. So this was interesting association, that you've had a very clear neurochemical difference and a behavioral difference. And even to this day, this hasn't been followed up, but I think it needs to be. The question is, could ayahuasca actually reverse these transporter deficits, and could it therefore be used in the treatment of alcoholism and behavioral dysfunctions associated with this reduced transporter expression? Of course, when it comes to doing a clinical study on ayahuasca, it's much more difficult than doing clinical studies on something like psilocybin, because ayahuasca is quintessentially a plant-based preparation, and there are many ingredients, not just necessarily the admixtures. It's hard to get that kind of a preparation approved through the FDA approval process. So that's one of the impediments to looking into this further. But of course, as always, there are ways around that, but it's worth following up. I think it's a very interesting finding, even though by now it's a very old finding. So this is our study was done here in 1993. Before this is just a chart of the number of publications about ayahuasca in PubMed over this period of time. Very little happening up until around 1995. Now it's exploded. Now, if you go into PubMed, you can find nearly 220 peer-reviewed papers on ayahuasca if you put ayahuasca into PubMed as a key word. So there's been a lot of work since our initial UDV study. Okay, so then in 2000, I initiated another ethnopharmacology. It was kind of a different direction, but I went to a seminar, a conference that was sponsored by NIDA, the National Institute of Drug Abuse, National Institute on Drug Abuse. The seminar had a kind of odd title. It was Potential Therapeutic Uses of Illicit Psychoactive Plants. And they invited me and some other people, Jonathan Ott and other people, to present. I gave my usual talk about ayahuasca. And then after that, I was contacted by a person from the Stanley Medical Research Institute, which is a non-profit organization that funds schizophrenia research. And the gentleman there said, well, I was at your talk, I was at your seminar, and enjoyed it. And I wonder if you would be interested in applying for a grant with the Stanley Medical Research Institute and he said, what our focus is schizophrenia, and we're interested in natural products. We're interested in better medications to treat schizophrenia. so would you be potentially interested in looking at Amazonian medicinal plants in this respect? He said, we've got a program going on with Chinese traditional medicine, but nothing going on with Amazonian medicine. And he said, and I said, well, at the time I was teaching at the University of Minnesota. I was an adjunct professor. I didn't really have a lab or anything like that. But he said, by the way, we gave away $130 million last year to study this to fund this kind of research. Basically, I said, well, where do I sign, And so I did submit a grant and got about $500,000, but that was enough to do this study, to do bioprospecting for plants that might potentially be used to treat the so-called negative symptoms of schizophrenia, not antipsychotics, but rather some of the cognitive deficits that go along with schizophrenia. There was indications that some of these medicines that used by the curanderos might be effective for that. So we used receptor binding technology. We screened extracts of the plants against about 30 different kinds of serotonin and other types of neurotransmitter receptors. Again, Juan Ruiz was instrumental in this. He was the guide for the expeditions that we did, and by this time he was the curator of the herbarium. This is one of our collaborators here, showing one of the specimen, Alan Shoemaker, who is an expat gringo living in Iquitos, and he and his wife Mariella helped organize a lot of the logistics and helped with getting permits from the different agencies and so on that we had to engage to do this work. So we carried this out. This happened from 2004 to about 2006. And this is our group on one of our first expeditions, a couple days downriver from Iquitos to this village called Genaro Herrera. So this is Juan Ruiz there in the UNAP T-shirt, a couple of our helpers that have joined our group, and our guide and a gentleman, Carlos Pabon, a fellow from Puerto Rico, and my friend Mike Mackey, who is a agroforester. So this was our merry band when we went on the first expedition. This is close up. Carlos is an amazing person. He's actually he looks like he is from a East LA Puerto Rican gang. He is from Puerto Rico, but he lives in California, and he's actually a brilliant molecular neuropharmacologist. And our guide at the time, who went by the appellation of Aku, as in Aku, very colorful fellow as well, ex-CIA, ex-special ops, lots of work, lots of experience in the jungles of Vietnam, Southeast Asia, and South America. And he had ended up in Iquitos as an expat and an occasional jungle guide, and he joined our expedition. Richard Fowler was his real name. He passed away a few years ago, but very, very cool guy. His motto was, give me the coordinates, I'll get you there. And maybe that's true. I never really tested it because the place that we were going was not that difficult to reach. But anyway, it was good to have him along. And eventually we published this. We came out of one. We published a single large paper out of this work in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology. We had other really useful collaborators, Dr. Brian Roth, who now runs the NIMH psychoactive drug screening program at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. they carried out all of the receptor assays. We prepared the extracts and sent them to his group for screening. And then the other collaborator on this was Dr. Thomas Hoy in the chemistry department at the University of Minnesota. His graduate students made the extracts and prepared them. So I didn't really have to get my hands dirty actually working at the bench. I did some of it, but there were much more competent people to do that work. But it was a collaborative effort, as science tends to be, and we came out with this paper, and I believe it was 2011. So a number of years after the expedition was essentially over. And during the expedition, we went back to Pucurquillo, where I visited in 1981. We went back to the same village and reconnected with those people. This is Aku there on the right, and a young woman, independent filmmaker, Sarah Hutt, who had kind of joined our group and wanted to do some filming. So she came along on this expedition, and as you can see, she's in the process of going native there. And it was great to have her because she was wanting to do a film on traditional medicine, not only ayahuasca, but just the whole scope of the thing. And eventually she did come out with a short documentary called The Shaman and the Scientist. And it won 2 or 3 awards at different film festivals, and it was actually recognized. So this is The Shaman and the Scientist. You can find it online. I don't think there's time to play this, but I'll put the link to it in the chat in a bit. And it's very interesting. It kind of gives you a picture of the dynamic way that ethnomedicine still exists in the Amazon, is still very important to people in their day-to-day lives. So another thing I want to mention, in 2017, I did a 50th anniversary commemorative symposium. In 1967, there was a conference in San Francisco, a private conference called the Ethnopharmacologic Search for Psychoactive Drugs, sponsored by the National Institute of Mental Health. It was a closed conference. The only thing that the taxpayers got for their money was the symposium volume. There were supposed to be follow-up conferences every 10 years, but the war on drugs intervened, and the government became kind of embarrassed that they'd ever even had anything to do with this. So, but the book came into my hands in 1968 at the age of 18, and I'm not sure where it came from, but I read it from cover to cover, and I decided this was going to be my career, psychoethnopharmacology. So it was a big motivator for me to go in that direction for my career. So in 2017, everything came together, and I was able to do a 50th anniversary commemorative symposium in the UK, and that's what this is. And you can look at espd50.com to look at the presenters and the topics, and then there's actually the videos from that conference are online still, and I'll put the link to those up if you want to go back and have a look. So we published the proceedings of the 2017 conference and the 1967 conference as a box set. We published the original and the 2017 proceedings. So, and that turned out to be pretty well received. So the book came out, Synergetic Press published the book. And interestingly, they also, that's another arm of this Institute of Ecotechnics, which was supporting us in 1981 when we were doing our field work. So what goes around comes around. We're still working with Synergetic Press, they're actually going to publish in later this year. They're going to publish the second edition of my my memoir, and we are planning right now ESPD 55, which will happen in May of this year in the UK, and that will be the 55th Anniversary Symposium. And again, you can find out details if you go to the McKenna Academy, and it's mckenna.academy, and there's nothing up there right now about this May conference. We're in the planning stages, but it is going to happen. It'll be, I think, at least as interesting as the first one and the second one in 2017. So it should be very, very interesting. And again, much of it will be online. There'll be online access, but if you have a hankering to go to the UK and stay in an amazing place and attend in person, I encourage that. When we did the 2017 conference, we did a live stream, and at some points we had 75,000 people watching. So many people know what ethnopharmacology means now that didn't before. So that is the end of my talk, and thank you for listening.
Ooh, wow. Thank you so much, Dennis. Such rich information and amazing work you've done over the years. Some of the comments are just huge gratitude to you, how humble you are. Here's one, wow, Dennis. So I think you have wowed this crowd.
Well, I didn't stop talking. It's a lot to unravel in an hour, but thank you all for listening, and I hope it was at least entertaining.
Oh, no, it was fabulous. And so anyone who has questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Marcia Zuckerman, would you like to ask your question?
You beat me to it. I just put it in the chat.
Do you want me to read it, or do you want?
Oh, why don't you read it? Yes.
Okay, thank you, Marcia. Marcia says, I was very interested in the serotonin receptor findings. There's apparently some anecdotal evidence that some long-term SSRI users don't respond robustly or at all to tryptamine-based psychedelics such as ayahuasca and psilocybin, even after a significant washout period. Has anyone looked at serotonin receptors on tryptamine non-responders?
As far as I know, they haven't. But what you say is true. I mean, I think part of the problem is it's very rare, but there are people who just do not respond. You know, and but it's very hard to put a study cohort together because this is such a kind of a rare and anomalous phenomenon. But I think it's worth looking into. You know, and that's the short answer, that it should be looked at. It hasn't been looked at, like so many of these things. You know, it all depends on funding, and you know, one of the things that's changed now because there's so much interest. I mean, the whole picture of psychedelics, as you know, has changed. So one thing that is positive is there is more funding, you know, for this kind of thing. So hopefully someone will look at that. In the same way, I wish that some group will investigate this ability of of ayahuasca to modulate, upregulate these serotonin transporter proteins, because that has to have therapeutic implications as well. So maybe someone will look into that. We're pretty sure that that effect is not due to the tryptamines. It's probably due to tetrahydroharmine, which is one of the beta carbolines in ayahuasca.
Thank you. Follow-up question from David Alexander. What if they take supplemental 5-HTP? Might that help with the non-response?
Supplemental 5-HTP to make more serotonin.
Right.
Yes.
It's not clear. I don't think it's a serotonin deficit. You know, I mean, it may, I mean, if there's more serotonin, you'd think that you know, the effect would be attenuated if the serotonin receptors are occupied by serotonin, they're competing with the tryptamines, you know. So again, this is way beyond my pay grade. You should ask a real neuroscientist. I'm a humble ethnobotanist, you know, but I know that people take 5-HTP, you know, to as a serotonin precursor, and they do it, you know, for MDMA, for example, which tends to deplete serotonin. So 5-HTP after MDMA restores that serotonin. But how it works in terms of these serotonin agonists, these 5-HT2A agonists that work postsynaptically, I'm not sure. You know, that's just one of the questions. You know, I mean, it's really a fascinating issue. Why do they not respond? You know, and you know, because most of us, if we take DMT or something like that, if we smoke DMT, it's like, you know, you come down, you're babbling, you're completely discombobulated. Some people is like, in fact, this I can anecdotally tell you, one of my relatives, back in the day, the husband of one of my cousins, Terrence, happened to be in Paonia, where I grew up. This was like a Christmas holiday, and he was back from Berkeley, and he had some DMT with him. And we went up to my cousin's house. I used to go up there and smoke pot with this gentleman. I won't say who it was, but Terrence was all excited. He said, "Oh, you've got to try this. You won't believe this." And this guy sat there and smoked 2 or 3 pipes of DMT and said, "Well, was something supposed to happen?" Terrence was like totally mortified, you know, because he expected him to melt into some kind of psychedelic ecstasy. And it was like, just sat there unruffled. So that was my first encounter with one of these non-responders. It's a complex thing, but it's hard to, you know, it's so much based on case studies and individuals. So it's hard to put together a coherent, you know, study on this kind of thing, but worth looking at for sure.
Great, thank you. Mark Bates, do you want to ask your questions?
Sure, coming off mute. Well, I'm really intrigued by the idea of a mystery school, mystery church, and your research with UDV, and I'm wondering if there are any implications for set and setting in clinical therapy models.
Well, so what is the question exactly? What?
Yeah, my apologies if it wasn't clear. So the this idea that you're promoting a mystical church model, and there may be some advantages of that type of model that I wonder if the clinical therapy model could learn from.
Okay. Well, first of all, the McKenna Academy, you know, we're a mystery school, but we're not a church. We're anything but a church. You know, we're kind of an anti-church because we think that you know, we're not really down with dogma and doctrine and that kind of structuring. But that said, you know, so we encourage, you know, when we do these physical events like the mystery school retreat that we did in November 2019, which is actually the last actual physical conference that we did before COVID kicked in. But we emphasize creating a place that is an optimal setting, you know, a safe setting, place where people can feel supported, and and then with a good curandero who can help guide the experience, but not really control it. We encourage people to have their own individual experiences, because that's the essence of the psychedelic experience, right? It's only you could have your own psychedelic experience. You can't delegate somebody else to have it for you. It's one of those few things in life that you have to just step up and do it yourself, kind of like being bored or dying. Can't delegate those kinds of things. And so our mystery school retreats have to do with providing an optimum setting where people can have their unique experience. And in the spirit of Eleusis, but we're not really trying to be Eleusis. We're trying to be a modern instantiation of this, where we're combining, I think the larger context of what you're seeing, I would like to see traditional practices and contemporary, more clinically oriented therapeutic use of psychedelics, bring those two things together and create a synergy, because really you neither one. Traditional practice, they've been at this for thousands of years, so they know a few things about how to use it. Clinicians, on the other hand, it's very recent that that's been done, but they also have things to contribute. So I'd like to see a fusion, a combination of these things, the best of clinical practice, the best of traditional practice, bring these things together. And my ideal for psychedelic therapy is, as it evolves and is accepted, is that I think that the substances should not be criminalized. They should just be decriminalized across the board and regulated, obviously, in a reasonable way, but not criminalized. And then that opens up the possibility that people could open centers that people could go to for these kinds of experiences. And much like you encounter in South America, but the need to go to South America, that has, that's not within everyone's reach, and there are some difficulties with that. Ideally, we could have centers, in the States, in Canada, where people could go. They would look more like spas than clinics. They would be places you could go for maybe a variety of health reasons, and then psychedelic therapy could be part of what's offered, and that's where I'd like to see it go. One of the issues with ayahuasca tourism, it's a good thing in some ways, but there's also difficulty. Every time you have sort of the global culture coming in contact with these fairly fragile indigenous contexts, it's going to change them, and not always for the better. So it's a complex thing, but I do think we're on the way to figuring out how to integrate psychedelics into our society. And I think that implies that we're maybe mature enough now to do that, although lots of evidence that our society is not so mature. But 40 years ago, this was unthinkable. And now it seems to be what's happening. So that's encouraging.
That's a wonderful place to end. May we all be alive to see that happen, Dennis.
We are alive, and we hope it will happen. Yes, indeed.
And thank you so much for your role in making it happen, and for all you've shared with us today. It's beautiful.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And Sherry, I will send you some links that you can share with your members, and links to the videos from ESPD 50 and a couple of projects that we're doing on this knowledge preservation documentary project, and the ESPD conference when it when it happens. So I'll just put those in emails and you're free to pass those around. So thank you so much for asking me.